Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Calvin Ridger bought a secluded cabin in Vermont, he thought he was escaping the chaos of city life. What he didn't expect was a neighbor like Linda Hammond, a woman who saw his arrival as an invasion, lies, sabotage, and a relentless war for control. But Calvin wasn't backing down. Calvin Ridger had spent the last 10 years buried in the world of tech startups, working sleepless nights and endless weeks to build a company that, against all odds, had been acquired by a major firm. The buyout left him with a financial cushion he had never dreamed of, and with it came a rare and precious opportunity: freedom. No more deadlines, no more investor meetings, no more living in a cramped apartment surrounded by the noise of the city. He wanted space. Peace, a place where he could finally breathe. That was how he found himself driving up a winding dirt road in the heart of Vermont, where thick pine trees stretched toward the sky and a sprawling lake shimmered in the midday sun. The 6-acre property had once belonged to an old hunter who, according to the real estate agent, had lived there for decades before finally selling and moving to Florida. The house itself was nothing fancy, a small weathered cabin with peeling paint and an aging dock that extended out into the water. It needed work, but that was part of the charm. This wasn't just a weekend getaway. It was a fresh start, a blank canvas. Sitting in the passenger seat, Trevor, his longtime friend from college, whistled as they pulled up in front of the cabin. "Man, this is the real deal," he said, stepping out of the truck and stretching his arms. "I still can't believe you actually did it. Left the city, bought a chunk of the wilderness. You've officially become one of those guys who wears flannel unironically." Calvin chuckled, stepping on to the uneven ground. The fresh, pine-scented air was an immediate contrast to the smog he'd left behind in Boston. "Give it a few months and I'll probably be growing a beard and learning how to chop wood," he joked. But in truth, the thought didn't seem so far-fetched. They spent the next few hours exploring the property. The shoreline was rugged but beautiful, with smooth stones scattered along the water's edge and a quiet stillness that made the whole place feel untouched. Calvin pointed out where he planned to build a new dock, maybe even expand the cabin if he decided to stay here long-term. The isolation wasn't intimidating. It was inviting. As the sun began its slow descent, they set up a couple of chairs near the water, cracked open beers, and talked about everything and nothing. Calvin felt lighter than he had in years. This was exactly what he needed, a place where he didn't have to be anything but himself. But just as he was beginning to relax, something, or rather someone, shattered the tranquility. A sharp voice cut through the stillness like a knife. "Excuse me." Both men turned their heads to see a woman marching toward them from the direction of the dirt road. She was in her 50s. Impeccably dressed in pressed slacks and a pastel sweater with blonde hair styled into a severe bob. Large designer sunglasses obscured her eyes, but everything about her posture screamed hostility. Calvin exchanged a look with Trevor before setting his beer down and standing up. "Can I help you?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. "You certainly can," she snapped. "What do you think you're doing here?" Trevor raised an eyebrow. "Hey, fishing." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is private property," she said curtly, "and I don't recall anyone giving you permission to be here." Calvin felt his stomach tighten. He had expected to meet neighbors at some point, but he hadn't anticipated an immediate confrontation. "Actually, this is my property," he said evenly. "I bought it last week. Name's Calvin Ridger." The woman let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "That's impossible. This land has belonged to the Johnson family for generations. Harold would never sell to—" She stopped herself abruptly, her expression twisting into something unreadable. Calvin felt a flicker of irritation but kept his composure. "Well, he did," he said, reaching for his phone. "I have all the paperwork if you'd like to see it." But she wasn't listening. Instead, she pulled out her own phone, her fingers moving with sharp, deliberate motions. "That won't be necessary," she said coldly, "because I'm calling the police." Calvin exchanged a glance with Trevor, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. This wasn't how he had imagined his first weekend at the cabin. He had expected maybe a curious neighbor stopping by to introduce themselves, not an angry woman threatening to call the cops on him for standing on his own property. "Look," Calvin started, keeping his tone calm, "there's no need to call the police. I have the deed in my truck. I can show it to you right now." But the woman, who still hadn't introduced herself, ignored him, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing at her phone screen. "Yes, I'd like to report trespassers," she said in a clipped, authoritative voice. "Yes, right now. They're refusing to leave private property." Calvin sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He wasn't going to argue with someone who clearly wasn't interested in listening to reason. Instead, he folded his arms and waited. "Seriously?" Trevor muttered. "You're just going to let her call the cops?" "It's better this way," Calvin said under his breath. "If we leave, she'll just say we ran because we were guilty of something. Let them come. I have nothing to hide." A few minutes later, the sound of tires crunching on gravel announced the arrival of a police cruiser. A uniformed officer, a man in his late 40s with a tired but no-nonsense expression, stepped out. "All right," the officer said, adjusting his belt as he approached. "Somebody want to tell me what's going on here?" Before Calvin could answer, the woman, Linda, as he later learned, launched into a dramatic tirade. "Officer, thank God you're here!" she exclaimed, gesturing wildly at Calvin and Trevor. "These two men are trespassing. I've told them multiple times to leave, but they refuse. I believe they may be squatters. Or worse, vandals." Trevor scoffed. "Vandals? We're standing here with fishing rods." Calvin took a steadying breath before addressing the officer directly. "My name is Calvin Ridger. I bought this property last week. I have all the paperwork to prove it in my truck." The officer turned to Linda, his expression carefully neutral. "Ma'am, do you have any proof that this land still belongs to Mr. Johnson?" Linda's face twitched with irritation. "I don't need proof. I've lived next door for 20 years. I know for a fact that this land was never sold." The officer glanced back at Calvin. "All right, let's see those documents." Calvin walked to his truck, retrieved the folder containing the deed and sale agreement, and handed them over. The officer examined them carefully, flipping through the pages while Linda hovered nearby, practically vibrating with indignation. After a moment, the officer looked up and nodded. "Everything checks out. This property does belong to Mr. Ridger." Linda's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "That's impossible," she snapped. "There must be a mistake. I demand you double-check." The officer gave her a pointed look. "Ma'am, I just did." Calvin exhaled, relieved, but his relief was short-lived. Linda wasn't finished. She turned on him, her expression a mix of outrage and something darker, something almost personal. "I don't care what your papers say," she hissed. "This land doesn't belong to you, and trust me, I'll make sure everyone in this town knows it." With that, she spun on her heel and stormed off, leaving Calvin with a sinking feeling that this was far from over. Calvin watched as Linda stormed off, her rigid posture radiating fury. The officer gave him a weary look, handing back the deed. "You're in the clear," the officer said, fastening the strap on his notepad. "But something tells me that woman isn't going to let this go." Calvin sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I got that impression too." "Keep those documents handy," the officer advised. "And if she tries anything, give us a call." The police cruiser rolled away, and for a moment the property was peaceful again. But that peace didn't last long. The next morning, as Calvin walked out onto his porch with a cup of coffee, he noticed something unusual at the base of his cabin's front door, a thick stack of papers shoved under the frame. Frowning, he crouched down, pulling them free. As soon as he saw the bold black letters across the top of the first sheet, his stomach sank. "Warning! Dangerous individual in the neighborhood." Beneath the title was a grainy, zoomed-in photo of him standing near the lake, likely taken without his knowledge. Below that, paragraphs of text described him as a suspicious outsider who had forged documents to steal property that had belonged to a respected member of the community for decades. It urged residents to be vigilant and report any sightings of his activities to none other than Linda Hammond, neighborhood watch captain. Calvin's fingers tightened around the paper. He flipped through the rest of the stack. Dozens of identical flyers, likely meant to be distributed around town. Some of them had hand-scrawled notes in the margins. "Keep our town safe. And we don't need people like him here." Trevor stepped out onto the porch, rubbing his eyes groggily. "What's up?" Wordlessly, Calvin handed him one of the flyers. As Trevor read, his expression darkened. "Are you kidding me? This is straight-up defamation." Calvin exhaled sharply, his mind racing. This wasn't just Linda complaining anymore. This was an organized smear campaign. His first instinct was to march over to her house and demand she stop. But what good would that do? Linda wasn't the kind of person who responded to reason. If she was willing to go this far, then she had no intention of backing down. No, this was more than an overreaction. This was war. And if she wanted to fight, she was going to get one. Calvin sat at his kitchen table, the stack of flyers spread out in front of him. The initial shock had faded, replaced by a slow-burning rage. Linda hadn't just accused him, she had painted him as a criminal, a dangerous outsider who needed to be watched, and by implication, removed. This wasn't some passive-aggressive stunt. It was a full-blown attack on his reputation. Trevor paced behind him, arms crossed. "All right, man, what's the move? You're not just going to let this psycho run wild, are you?" Calvin shook his head. "Absolutely not." He tapped one of the flyers. "This is defamation. If she thinks she can just spread lies about me without consequences, she's in for a rude awakening." His first stop was the local police station. The officer at the front desk, a different one from before, gave the flyers a cursory glance before sighing. "Look, Mr. Ridger, I understand why you're upset, but technically this isn't illegal. She's expressing an opinion." Calvin narrowed his eyes. "An opinion? She's accusing me of fraud and warning people to report me for crimes that don't exist. That's not an opinion. That's slander." The officer hesitated. "We can't arrest her for this, but you could file an official complaint for harassment. If she escalates, we'd have a paper trail." It wasn't the instant resolution Calvin wanted, but it was a start. He filed the complaint and made copies of every single flyer. His next move, a lawyer. Trevor called in a favor from his cousin, Emily Warren, a sharp-witted attorney specializing in civil cases. They met at a local cafe where Calvin laid out the situation. She read the flyers carefully, her expression hardening as she flipped through them. "This is actionable," she said finally. "She's spreading false information with the intent to harm your reputation. That's textbook defamation." Calvin exhaled, finally feeling like he had some ground to stand on. "So, what do? We start with a cease and desist letter. It's a formal legal demand for her to retract these accusations and stop any further actions against you. If she ignores it, we escalate. Sue her for defamation." A slow grin spread across Trevor's face. "I'd love to see her face when she gets served." Emily drafted the letter that afternoon. It was direct and legally airtight. If Linda continued her campaign against Calvin, she'd be facing a very real lawsuit. The next morning, a process server hand-delivered the letter to Linda's front door. Calvin and Trevor watched from a distance as she snatched the envelope from the man, tore it open, and read. Her face flushed a deep red, and for a moment, it looked like she might scream. Instead, she ripped the letter into shreds, threw the pieces onto her lawn, and stomped back inside. Trevor whistled. "That went well." Calvin crossed his arms. "Oh, she's pissed. But now she knows. She's not untouchable." For the first time since this nightmare started, Calvin felt like he had some control. Linda had played dirty, but now she was on notice. The war wasn't over, but now it had rules. For a few days after receiving the cease and desist letter, Linda seemed to disappear. No new flyers, no sudden appearances on Calvin's property, no more exaggerated accusations spreading through the town. It was unsettling. Calvin had expected some kind of reaction, yelling, a counterattack, even an attempt to negotiate. But silence? That was worse. It meant she was plotting something. Trevor remained skeptical. "Maybe she finally realized she's screwed," he suggested, as they sat on the porch one evening, beers in hand. "She got served a legal warning. Maybe that was enough to scare her off." Calvin wasn't convinced. People like her don't back down, they regroup. And he was right. The first sign that Linda wasn't finished came 3 nights later. Calvin had just gone to bed when his motion-detecting cameras picked up movement. His phone buzzed with an alert, and he opened the live feed. A dark figure moved near his truck. At first, he thought it was an animal, but then the figure stepped closer, and in the dim glow of the security lights, Calvin saw the unmistakable shape of a person in a hooded sweatshirt. His pulse quickened. Was someone trying to break in? Trevor was already asleep in the spare room, so Calvin grabbed the handgun he kept in his bedside drawer, a precaution he had never thought he'd actually need. Quietly, he slipped outside through the back door, staying low as he crept around the house. The intruder hadn't seen him yet. They were crouched near the front of his truck, doing something near the tires. Calvin's stomach twisted with realization. They were slashing them. Before he could call out, the figure turned, and Calvin locked eyes with Linda Hammond. Her face was twisted in a furious sneer, her breath ragged as she clenched the knife in her hand. The sweet, respectable neighborhood watch captain was gone. This was pure, unfiltered malice. Calvin took a step forward, gun lowered but visible. "Put the knife down, Linda." She didn't. Instead, she let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You don't belong here," she hissed. "This town isn't yours. This land isn't yours." "You lost," Calvin said. "Let it go." "I don't lose," she spat. Then she lunged, not at him, but toward his house. Calvin reacted instinctively. He didn't fire the gun, but he lunged after her, grabbing her wrist and yanking her back before she could get far. She shrieked, struggling against him, and in the scuffle, the knife clattered onto the gravel driveway. That was when Trevor burst out of the house, holding a baseball bat. "What the hell is going—" He froze when he saw Linda struggling in Calvin's grip, the knife on the ground at her feet. The security cameras had caught everything. Linda was panting, wild-eyed, defeated. Then, as if realizing she had no way out, she suddenly collapsed onto the ground, wailing. "He attacked me," she screamed, clutching her wrist. "He tried to kill me. Help!" Trevor let out a bitter laugh. "Are you serious? You just got caught slashing his tires, and now you're playing the victim." The police arrived within minutes. Linda immediately broke into tears, claiming Calvin had assaulted her. But Calvin simply gestured to the security cameras. One of the officers, the same one from before, sighed as he reviewed the footage. "Mrs. Hammond," he said, his voice tinged with exhaustion, "you're under arrest for trespassing, property damage, and making false claims to law enforcement." As they cuffed her, she screamed threats at Calvin, her voice hoarse and desperate. "This isn't over. I will ruin you." "You think you've won?" Calvin just shook his head. "You already lost." As the police dragged her to the squad car, he watched in silence. This wasn't just a petty feud anymore. This had been war. And he had won. Linda Hammond was taken into custody that night, screaming until her voice cracked. Calvin stood on his porch, watching the red and blue lights flicker across the treetops as the police drove her away. He should have felt relieved, vindicated, even satisfied. But instead, all he felt was a slow, gnawing exhaustion. The war was over, but at what cost? The days leading up to the trial passed in a blur. Linda was formally charged with trespassing, property damage, and false accusations against Calvin. Thanks to the security footage and her own psychotic behavior, the case against her was ironclad. Still, Calvin knew that someone as manipulative as Linda wouldn't go down quietly, and he was right. When she appeared in court 2 weeks later, she was no longer the crazed woman who had lunged at him with a knife in his driveway. She was composed, prim, and dressed in conservative pastels, her blonde bob styled neatly. Sitting at the defendant's table, she was the very image of a grieving victim. Her lawyer, a sharp-dressed man with a practiced smile, wasted no time in spinning the story. According to them, Linda had merely been trying to protect the community. She had felt threatened by a stranger who suddenly appeared and stole a beloved piece of land. She had acted out of fear, not malice. And the damage? A misunderstanding. It was almost impressive how much she twisted the truth. But Calvin's lawyer, Emily Warren, was sharper. "Mrs. Hammond," she said, standing confidently before the courtroom, "can you explain why you were caught on camera slashing Mr. Ridger's tires at 2 a.m? Linda pursed her lips. "I was afraid. I thought—" Emily cut her off. "Afraid of what? A man asleep in his home on property he legally owns?" Linda hesitated. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but she was too deep in her lies to stop now. "I was trying to send a message," she admitted finally, as if she expected that to justify everything. Calvin could practically hear her lawyer groaning. That was all the prosecution needed. The judge listened to the final arguments and, after reviewing all the evidence, including the flyers, security footage, and police reports, the verdict was clear. Linda was found guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to pay fines for property damage, given a restraining order preventing her from coming within 500 feet of Calvin's land, and ordered to complete community service. The charges of false accusations didn't land her jail time, but her reputation was irreparably destroyed. Calvin watched as her face twisted in barely contained rage while the judge announced the sentence. For the first time, she had lost control. She shot Calvin a withering look as she was escorted out of the courtroom. Even in defeat, she radiated venom. "This isn't over," she mouthed silently. But Calvin wasn't afraid anymore. The weeks after the trial were eerily quiet. No more flyers, no more unwanted visitors, no more sabotage. Linda had become a ghost. Her house, once the hub of neighborhood gossip, now sat lifeless. Rumors spread through town. Some said she was planning to sell her house and leave. Others whispered that she had become a recluse, humiliated beyond recovery. Calvin didn't care either way. With Linda finally out of his way, he focused on rebuilding. He repaired the damage, reinforced his property with new security measures, and slowly but surely, the cabin became his true home. One evening, as he stood on the dock, watching the sun dip below the lake, Trevor cracked open a beer beside him. "Well, buddy, you survived. Not a bad way to start your new life." Calvin exhaled, feeling the weight of the past months finally lifting off his shoulders. "Yeah," he said, a small smile forming. "Not bad at all." But deep down, a small voice whispered in the back of his mind. Linda wasn't the type to let go. And even though the war had ended, Calvin knew one thing for certain. There's always another battle waiting on the horizon.